Welcome back, friends. Tonight, I want to invite you on a journey not into the future, but deep into the past. Picture this. The year is 1875. The streets are lit by flickering gas lamps. The air is heavy with coal smoke, and fortunes are counted not in bank transfers, but in estates, servants, and the gleam of silver spoons. Imagine, just for one evening, that you've woken up, not as yourself, but as a millionaire in Victorian England. Okay. Now, before we dive headfirst into this gilded world of top hats and towering mansions, take a moment to get comfortable. Dim the lights, grab a blanket, and settle in. If you enjoy stepping into history's stranger, quirkier corners, go ahead and tap that like button, subscribe, and join our growing community. It really helps this channel continue to create these long, immersive storytelling experiences for you. And if you've been here before, welcome back. You know the drill. So, what exactly does it mean to be a millionaire in the Victorian age? Wealth in this era wasn't just about having money. It was about performance, about putting on a constant show of status. Your home wasn't simply a place to live, okay? It was a stage set for the world to admire, okay? Every curtain, every chandelier, every unnecessary piece of silver-plated tableware had one purpose. It's going to remind anyone who stepped through your door that you belonged to the upper crust of society. But wealth came with its own absurdities. Imagine sleeping in a bed so large that your feet are still cold under 5 layers of embroidered blankets. Servants scurry across acres of carpet just to bring you a lukewarm glass of water, apologizing 3 times before you even take a sip. Dressing yourself, impossible. That would be like announcing to the world that you didn't matter enough to have a valet. And then, of course, there's the infamous breakfast ritual cold toast. A mountain of cutlery and a seating order so strict it could start a family feud. Over the course of this video, we'll peel back the layers of this life, from the strange and theatrical morning routines, to the endless layers of clothing, to the dining tables groaning with food few actually wanted to eat. We'll meet the servants who kept these households running, the children who were treated more like ornaments than family, and the pets who were dressed up in clothes fancier than most people owned. This eccentric, just a story of wealth that has a glimpse at how money reshaped every detail of daily life, sometimes in ways that feel more ridiculous than enviable. Because to be rich in the Victorian era was to live in constant performance, where comfort was less important than appearances, and where every action, from how you sipped your tea to the way you greeted your guests, carried hidden meaning. So stay with me until the end of this journey. You'll laugh, you'll shake your head in disbelief, and maybe you'll be a little grateful for your own simpler daily routine. Okay, now let's step into the velvet-draped, chandelier-lit world of the Victorian millionaire. To truly step into this world, we need to push open the doors of time and wander through a life so unlike our own that it feels both dazzling, absurd, because life as a Victorian millionaire was never just about money sitting quietly in a vault or numbers glowing on a screen. It was about a daily theater of extravagance, a carefully orchestrated performance in which every waking moment was wrapped in ritual costume and ceremony. And while modern wealth may sometimes mean convenience or efficiency, Victorian wealth meant exactly the opposite. It meant finding the most complicated, inconvenient, exhausting way to display your fortune, because simplicity could be mistaken for poverty. And nothing terrified the wealthy elite more than being confused with the merely comfortable. From the instant you opened your eyes, you were reminded that luxury was not rest, but labor, because you never woke alone. Instead, your awakening was accompanied by the hushed footsteps of servants who hovered at the edge of your vast bedroom, bearing water, clothing, and news of your household, all while apologizing for the temperature of the glass or the lateness of the newspaper. And even before you swung your legs from the bed, your wealth had already set half a dozen people in motion, their entire purpose being to ensure that your day began not with ease, but with spectacle. The curtains were drawn back not by you, but by hands trained to move in silence. The fire was kept alive through the night, so you would never shiver as you stirred. And even the angle at which your morning slippers were placed on the rug had been considered carefully, because to live as a millionaire in Victorian England was to live inside a carefully choreographed ballet where every gesture was meant to whisper to the world that you were different, elevated, and untouchable. And yet, beneath the layers of embroidery and etiquette, there was something faintly comical about the entire routine, because the very rituals meant to prove refinement often bordered on the absurd. Imagine needing an attendant to warm your socks before you could wear them, or summoning a valet simply because fastening a collar by yourself was deemed unworthy of your station, or finding your breakfast so overburdened with rules that the act of lifting a teacup required the focus of a trained actor. Every small moment was inflated into ceremony, and in that ceremony lay the true power of wealth, because it was never enough to possess riches. You had to demonstrate them constantly, whether by the shine of your silver, the starch of your collar, or the endless apologies of your staff. To imagine yourself in this position is to realize how suffocating luxury could become, for the grandeur was not a backdrop to life, but the essence of it, and whether you dined, dressed, or entertained, the purpose was always the same: to prove your belonging within the upper layers of a society obsessed with appearances and terrified of scandal, where extravagance was measured not just in diamonds or acres, but in how completely you could transform ordinary human needs into extraordinary spectacles of status. Let us wander deeper now, because no vision of the Victorian millionaire's life can truly be complete without first setting the stage upon which this grand, and at times ridiculous, drama unfolds. And that stage was not simply a house in the ordinary sense, but rather a sprawling theater of wealth, where every room was designed to astonish and every detail carried the weight of social meaning. For when you stepped across the threshold of such a mansion, you were not entering a private home, but an architectural proclamation, a statement carved in stone and polished wood that declared to all who saw it that this family had arrived at the pinnacle of prosperity. The front façade loomed with rows of tall windows, each draped in velvet, heavy enough to crush a lesser curtain rod, and beyond the entrance hall stretched corridors, lined with marble busts of ancestors, some genuine and some commissioned after the fact, to manufacture an aura of antiquity, because in this world, even history could be purchased if you had the funds. Inside, armies of servants moved with the silent efficiency of a stage crew during a performance, their presence at once constant and invisible. For while you might not notice the scullery maid scrubbing until her hands ached, or the footman polishing silver until it gleamed like captured moonlight, you were always meant to notice the results, the floors that shone, the banquets that appeared as if by magic, the fires that burned as though they tended themselves. And it was precisely this endless orchestration of hidden labor that allowed the millionaire to glide through life as if the material world simply bent to their will. Yet, to those who looked closely, there was comedy woven into this grandeur, because the comforts, while extravagant, often tipped into the absurd. Beds, so vast, they seemed fit for an entire regiment rather than the people. Dining tables, so long that conversation required shouting or signaling through servants, and wardrobes so overstuffed with fabrics and feathers that merely choosing an outfit resembled the logistics of a small military campaign. What made it fascinating, though, was not just the scale of these luxuries, but the contradictions they revealed. Because while every detail shouted wealth, much of it also whispered inconvenience. The velvet curtains trapped dust and drafts alike. The grand chandeliers threatened to smoke out guests if too many candles were lit, and the elaborate heating systems groaned like wounded animals without ever managing to keep the vast rooms consistently warm. And so, the millionaire's life became a constant balancing act between indulgence and endurance, where servants rushed to disguise the discomforts, but never truly erased them. Still, appearances mattered above all else, and as long as the drawing room sparkled, and the table groaned under the weight of dishes few really enjoyed. Eating the illusion of effortless magnificence was maintained, leaving the outsider dazzled, amused, and perhaps just a little suspicious of whether such a life was really as enviable as it seemed. And so the performance of wealth continued from the very first light of morning. 'Cause awakening in a mansion of the Victorian elite was never a solitary or simple affair. It was instead a carefully orchestrated ritual in which the act of opening one's eyes set in motion an entire chain of service and ceremony, beginning with the soft creak of doors as a maid slipped inside with the skill of someone trained to move like a shadow, bearing a tray with a glass of water that was never quite cold and never quite hot, but always delivered at that peculiar lukewarm temperature which, for reasons lost to time, was considered the proper way to begin the day. And though you might take only a sip, the presentation of it mattered more than the refreshment itself, for every gesture in this household carried symbolic weight. The fire in the grate had been kept alive through the night by a shivering under-butler who had stood guard over the embers so that you would never feel the indignity of waking in a cold chamber. And as you stirred beneath layers of embroidered blankets, the silence of the room was broken only by the muffled apologies of servants, anxious that the water might not be to your liking, or that the newspaper might have been delivered a moment too late. And in those apologies lay the true essence of your position, because even before you spoke a word, half a dozen people were already laboring to maintain the fiction that wealth made life effortless. To rise from bed was itself a kind of ceremony, for the furniture was so vast and the covers so heavy that leaving them unaided bordered on impossible. And thus you called upon your valet, a figure of infinite patience and quiet authority, whose sole duty was to ensure that you never faced the dangerous task of dressing yourself. For in the eyes of Victorian high society, such independence would have been seen as unthinkably lowly, a confession that you belonged among the middling classes who buttoned their own cuffs and tied their own cravats. Instead, the valet presented a selection of garments arranged with the precision of a jeweler displaying gems shirts, starched until they were almost architectural waistcoats embroidered so ornately they might be mistaken for family crests, and collars designed less to clothe than to test one's endurance, for they gripped the throat with an unyielding stiffness that turned every movement of the head into a quiet act of bravery. The process of dressing was not rushed, but unfolded with the deliberation of a sacred rite, layers added one after another, while attendants brushed, adjusted, and tugged with choreographed efficiency until you were transformed not merely into a person ready for the day, but into a living emblem of wealth and status. Even the smallest details were imbued with significance. Slippers lined with sheepskin so plush that they felt more like animals than footwear. Dressing gowns perfumed with exotic scents, described as the essence of empire. Hair brushed into submission by the steady hand of a servant, while the day's schedule was recited in tones as solemn as scripture. And though the entire process might leave you slightly suffocated, perhaps even faint from the corset or the endless layering of fabrics, the discomfort was considered part of the privilege. For true luxury in this world was never about ease, but about proving that you could endure extravagance for its own sake. By the time you were finally declared ready, you had not so much prepared for the day as enacted a spectacle of refinement. A private theater witnessed by servants, yet designed to echo through the halls in whispers, ensuring that everyone in the household knew that their master or mistress had once again begun the morning not with simplicity, but with ceremony befitting the wealthy few who believed themselves destined to be seen, judged, and envied. No sooner had the ordeal of dressing reached its final flourish than another trial of wealth awaited. For in the households of Victorian millionaires, the matter of bathing was never a simple retreat into privacy, but rather a performance that combined the unpredictability of experimental science with the solemnity of a public ritual, because to wash in that age was to confront a collection of challenges that modern comfort has long since erased. Beginning with the tub itself, a monstrous vessel of porcelain and marble that could easily have accommodated a small family, yet stood ready for the sole purpose of holding water that was either scalding enough to redden the skin or so icy that one. S-bones ached at the mere thought of entering, and somewhere behind the walls, types rattled and groaned as though offended by the very idea of delivering water on command. Into this scene came the attendant sand ensemble cast of bath boys, valets, and sometimes even a lurking plumber darting about with buckets, cowls, and expressions of both dread and duty, their combined efforts meant to disguise the fact that the marvel of indoor plumbing was as temperamental as a nervous thoroughbred and twice as likely to cause a disaster. The ritual began with servants hauling water from the kitchen, flushed with exertion, as they poured bucket after bucket into the tub, consulting almanacs or even sniffing the contents to judge whether today's supply would run clear, murky, or tinged with mysterious hues better left unexplained. And while you might be fortunate enough to possess taps that promised the luxury of hot and cold on demand, these were devices of such unreliability that mastering them resembled conducting a chemistry experiment, requiring one to alternate between bursts of scalding heat and shocks of glacial cold until the balance was just tolerable. To this already precarious scene was added the presence of products that made the experience less of a cleansing and more of an endurance trial, for the soaps came in bars so hard they might double as weapons, and the tooth powders concocted from chalk, charcoal, and other abrasives left the mouth not fresh but faintly bruised, while lotions and unguents of mysterious origin were pressed into service with a hopeful claim of warding off ailments, yet often leaving only the scent of rosewater mingled with regret. Privacy, a notion cherished today, was all but absent here, for the bather was never alone. Screens were arranged to provide a semblance of modesty, while valets hovered with towels, maids adjusted the folding chairs, and occasionally a plumber appeared from some hidden corner to address the inevitable calamity of a pipe bursting or a tap launching itself across the room. And though every participant politely avoided direct acknowledgement of one another's discomfort, the truth was that bathing resembled less a moment of calm and more a communal performance in which all were bound by an unspoken agreement never to mention the indignities endured. At the heart of it all stood the magnificent porcelain throne, upholstered like a chair of state and carved as though intended for royalty, yet serving the most practical of purposes. And here again the precarious nature of technology revealed itself, for every pull of the chain was a gamble between a dignified flush and a minor indoor flood, leaving the bather to contemplate whether luxury might not at times resemble punishment. When at last the ordeal concluded and you emerged, red-cheeked and half-dazed, swaddled in towels monogrammed with your initials, lest you forget your identity amid the chaos, there came the faintest sense of triumph. For though the process had threatened embarrassment and disaster at every turn, you had survived another round with Victorian plumbing, and could now face the day freshly scoured, humbled by the absurdity of excess, and reminded once more that in this gilded age, even the most personal acts of life were transformed into elaborate spectacles where comfort was secondary in appearance. Ritual and endurance were everything. If bathing was a trial that tested the patience of servants and the resilience of plumbing alike, then the act of dressing was something even grander. A daily pageant of fabric and form in which the body itself became the stage upon which wealth announced its presence. For in the houses of Victorian millionaires, clothing was never simply about covering the body or keeping out the chill. It was about constructing a visual proclamation that screamed refinement, excess, and social standing to anyone with insight. And the effort required to achieve such an appearance was nothing short of monumental, for no single person, however determined, could possibly hope to dress alone when fashion demanded layers upon layers of intricately engineered garments. each one designed to fit into the next, like the pieces of a puzzle whose only solution was discomfort disguised as elegance. The valet entered first, arms heavy with stiff trousers, gleaming waistcoats, and shirts starched until they seemed as though they had been forged from plaster rather than cloth, followed by a maid with gloves, shoes, and the delicate accessories, without which no outfit could be considered complete. And together they set about the task of transforming you from a mere human being into a spectacle of fabric and ornament, an endeavor that required choreography, endurance, and the unspoken knowledge that failure in presentation was nothing short of social disaster. For men, the process began with undergarments so cumbersome they might pass for evening attire in a less demanding century, drawers and undershirts that clung in layers before the true battle commenced with the dreaded corset. For yes, gentlemen of wealth often found themselves bound into these constricting devices, the ribs compressed and their posture forcibly corrected until they resembled not living men, but the idealized figures adorning portraits, and while the corset stole the breath, it gifted the silhouette that society demanded. Once secured, the starched shirt was pulled into place. Its collar, so unyielding, it pressed against the throat with the persistence of a vice, followed by waistcoats embroidered with flourishes that might double as family crests, and jackets cut so stiffly they could nearly stand on their own. And finally, the accessories: pocket watches suspended from chains of gold, ties folded and knotted with the solemnity of a coronation, gloves for every occasion, and hats so tall they imperiled chandeliers, each item less a necessity than a weapon in the ongoing battle for status. For women, the ritual was even more elaborate, a construction project of fabric and bone that transformed the body into an architectural marvel, beginning with chemises and stays before giving way to corsets tightened with merciless precision, then layer upon layer of petticoats, bustles, and skirts that spread outward like sails on a great ship, so that entering a room became less a matter of walking and more a negotiation with space itself. Dresses and silks and velvets descended from above as though lowering stage curtains, while maids tugged and pinned and adjusted with the urgency of artisans racing against time, and when at last the gown was settled, it was followed by accessories of such dizzying variety that the very act of remembering which gloves or brooches belonged to which hour of the day required a staff dedicated solely to fashion management. Hats soared with feathers and ribbons, shoes fastened with buttons so small they demanded specialized tools, and jewelry glittered in ostentatious layers upon neck and wrist until the wearer was less an individual than a living display case of imported finery. The entire ordeal could consume hours, and by the time it concluded, the result was less a person prepared to live than a figure sculpted for admiration. Someone who might sit at breakfast already exhausted, lungs pressed by corsets, skin prickled beneath wool, and yet glowing with the satisfaction that discomfort had once again been transformed into spectacle. Comfort was irrelevant, practicality a sin, for the true function of clothing was to signal at every glance that you were part of the ruling few, able to suffer for beauty and wealth while others labored to keep you dressed, adjusted, and polished. And so the day began, not with ease, but with ceremony. Each garment a declaration, each accessory a coded message, and each layer a reminder that in Victorian England appearance was not simply part of life, it was life itself. By the time the dressing ritual had concluded, and the figure in the mirror bore no resemblance to the half-asleep soul who had first stirred beneath heavy covers, the next act in this unending theater of wealth awaited, and it was not the indulgent, comforting meal that modern minds might imagine when they hear the word breakfast, but rather a choreographed performance where food played a supporting role and etiquette took center stage. For in the grand dining rooms of Victorian millionaires, the morning meal was less about nourishment and more about demonstrating one's mastery of ritual, self-restraint, and social awareness. The dining table itself stretched the length of a small boat, polished until the surface gleamed like still water, and lined with an intimidating array of silver cutlery that suggested more surgical procedure than casual dining. With servants stationed like silent sentinels along the walls, ready to swoop in at the faintest nod or subtle glance. Seating was never left to chance, for the order in which family members and guests positioned themselves was a delicate reflection of hierarchy, rank, and favor, so that even the smallest deviation in uncle attempting to sit above his station, a guest placing herself beside the host without invitation, could send ripples of scandal through drawing rooms for weeks. The meal itself, though varied and abundant, was often a curious blend of luxury and disappointment, for wild dishes of eggs, kidneys, kippers, sausages, and porridge might be laid out with ceremonial precision. The timing of their arrival and the sheer distance they traveled across the expansive table meant that much of it reached a plate lukewarm at best, and nowhere was this more notorious than in the matter of toast, which was invariably served cold, a detail so consistent that it became almost a symbol of the meal itself, an emblem of how the appearance of refinement outweighed the simple pleasure of eating something warm. Servants rotated among the diners, with dishes balanced precariously on silver trays, eyes lowered so as never to intrude upon the conversations above them, while footmen circulated with teapots and coffee services pouring with an elegance that disguised the anxiety of ensuring that not a single drop stained the gleaming tablecloth, for even the smallest error could mark a career with disgrace. Conversation at the breakfast table was no freer than the seating or the food, bound as it was by invisible threads of etiquette that dictated who might speak first, what topics were acceptable, and how long each response should last, so that even the most mundane subjects, weather reports, society news, the latest shipments from abroad were delivered with the gravitas of parliamentary debate. Silence, though frowned upon, was often preferable to a misstep, for one ill-chosen comment could set the tone for the entire day, and so voices rose and fell like carefully rehearsed music, with pauses calibrated to allow for the clinking of cups, the clearing of throats, or the discreet removal of plates by servants. For the children who might be present at the far end of the table, under the watchful eyes of governesses, the experience was one of both dread and training, for each bite and each word were lessons in how to inhabit the role of wealth without betraying nervousness or hunger. When the final dishes were cleared and the ritual wound to a close, there was rarely the sense of satisfaction one associates with a hearty meal, but rather a subdued relief that the ordeal had been endured without embarrassment, that no cup had been tipped too loudly, no knife misused, no toast eaten too eagerly, and in this relief lay the essence of Victorian wealth. The triumph was not in comfort, but in control, not in flavor, but in form, and the breakfast table, for all its cold, its toast, and rigid etiquette, was one of the most powerful stages upon which a millionaire could prove to family, guests, and servants alike that they belonged to a class that valued appearances above all else. If the breakfast table was the public stage where wealth revealed itself through ritual and restraint, then the rest of the house was the backstage machinery, a vast and intricate system of human effort that sustained the illusion of effortless grandeur. For behind every polished surface, every neatly folded napkin, every perfectly timed appearance of food or fire, there existed an entire hierarchy of servants whose lives were devoted to ensuring that the world of the Victorian millionaire never slipped out of its gilded mask. At the top of this pyramid stood the butler, a figure both feared and revered, who managed the cellar, the silver, and the overall order of the household with a precision that rivaled a general commanding an army, and beneath him stretched layers of authority that divided tasks so carefully that each servant knew not only what they were expected to do, but also what they must never attempt, for to cross the invisible lines of duty was as much a breach of decorum as spilling wine across the tablecloth. The cook reigned in the kitchen with the temperamental authority of an artist whose canvas was the dinner plate, barking orders through a haze of steam and smoke, while the scullery maids clattered endlessly with pots and pans, their hands raw from lye and water, yet unacknowledged by those who consumed the dishes above stairs. The housekeeper, mistress of the linens and the maids, moved like a shadow through the corridors, ensuring that every sheet was crisp, every curtain brushed, every speck of dust hunted down before it could betray the illusion of perfection. Footmen, chosen as much for their height and appearance as for their abilities, acted as ornaments as well as laborers, their gleaming uniforms, in silent presence, transforming them into living pieces of furniture whose primary duty was to project elegance while ferrying dishes, trays, and messages from one end of the house to the other. Beyond the immediate walls stretched still more servants, gardeners, whose hands coaxed beauty from soil regardless of season, shaping hedges into geometric marvels and nursing roses so delicate they seemed more painted than grown. Stable boys and coachmen who kept horses brushed to a mirror-like sheen in carriages, gleaming as though they had never touched a road. Governesses and nannies who became the true parents of children, raised more by duty than affection, stilling lessons in posture, manners, and silence with the relentlessness of drill sergeants. Each role was distinct, each duty carefully guarded, and in this hierarchy lay both the strength and the fragility of the household. For the entire edifice of luxury depended on hundreds of invisible gestures performed without error, and a single slip of glass polished too slowly, a floor creaking underfoot. A child appearing in the drawing room at the wrong moment could ripple outward into whispers of incompetence that no millionaire could endure. What made it remarkable was not merely the scale of this system, but the way it turned the house itself into a living organism. Its veins, the hidden corridors through which servants scurried unseen. Its heart, the kitchen pulsing with heat and motion. Its lungs, the chimneys belching smoke as maids stoked fires before dawn. All of it working in tireless rhythm so that the drawing rooms above remained tranquil, the breakfast tables serene, and the illusion of untroubled wealth intact. And yet, though the masters floated through their days, believing themselves untouched by labor, the truth was that their every gesture, the sip of tea, the donning of gloves, the opening of a carriage door, was supported by countless hands moving in the shadows, hands that rarely received acknowledgement, yet bore the weight of maintaining a world built not on comfort, but on constant performance. Yet, for all the grandeur that shimmered above stairs, for all the polished silver and gleaming glass and neatly choreographed rituals that dazzled guests and soothed the egos of their masters, life below stairs was defined by a very different rhythm, one governed not by luxury, but by vigilance. For the servants who sustained this glittering world lived in a constant state of alertness. There, every movement weighed against the possibility of error and the knowledge that even the smallest step, a cup placed at the wrong angle, a garment buttoned in haste, a word spoken out of turn could summon consequences far greater than the mistake itself. They inhabited a world of perpetual caution, where silence was safer than speech, where eyes were trained to notice a candle guttering before it disturbed the atmosphere of a drawing room, where hands moved instinctively to catch a teacup before it rattled on the saucer. And in this endless dance of anticipation lay the true cost of maintaining the illusion of effortless wealth. A butler might spend hours rehearsing the order of service for a dinner party, drilling the footmen as though preparing for battle, not because the placement of forks or the timing of a soup course truly mattered, but because one error could ripple outward into whispers of incompetence, whispers that clung to a household's reputation like damp on stone. A maid might creep barefoot through the halls at dawn, terrified that the echo of her footsteps might disturb her employers, her heart pounding with each stair that creaked, while the cook, sweating before the range, knew that a dish sent back from the dining room would not only wound her pride, but also stain her standing within the household. Even the governess, nominally above the rank of servants, lived with the knowledge that a child's misbehavior might be laid at her door, her future employment jeopardized by a tantrum or a tear. This climate of fear created a peculiar paradox. The more wealth a household possessed, the more delicate its machinery became, and the more fragile the lives of those who oiled its gears. And yet, despite this tension, was precisely the unseen labor of these men and women that gave the world above its sheen of tranquility. For the millionaire who sat serenely at the breakfast table could do so only because 10 pairs of hands had risen before dawn to stoke fires, iron napkins, polish silver, and prepare trays. The lady who swept into a ballroom, trailing silks and jewels, could maintain her composure only because her maid had endured hours of fastening hooks, smoothing hems, and pinning hair into place, all while bracing herself for criticism, if so much as a ribbon sat askew. What the world admired as elegance was in truth the product of invisible endurance, a labor so constant and so hidden that it seemed to vanish, leaving only the illusion of effortless grace in its wake. And so the household existed in a strange duality: above, a realm of spectacle, where wealth performed itself with studied ease, and below, a realm of anxious industry, where every servant lived on the knife edge of expectation. Their value measured not by what they accomplished, but by how seamlessly they erased themselves from view, above this world of silent labor and anxious perfection. There shimmered another layer of performance, one that clothed the body itself in symbols of wealth. For fashion among the Victorian elite was not a matter of personal taste or comfort, but a relentless competition in which every gown, every coat, every jewel, and every accessory served as both armor and advertisement, announcing one's place in the hierarchy to all who looked upon it. To step into society improperly dressed was to risk humiliation, for garments were as much a language as words, and in this language the wealthy spoke in syllables of silk, velvet, lace, and gold, each fabric chosen not for its practicality, but for its ability to impress, to dazzle, and to endure the scrutiny of rivals who scanned every hem and button as though reading a coded message. For women, this competition demanded a daily transformation that pushed the limits of endurance. Corsets laced so tightly that breaths came shallow and movements turned stiff. Skirts layered with petticoats and bustles until the simple act of walking across a room became an ordeal requiring calculation. And gowns constructed with fabrics so heavy that the shoulders ached before the evening had even begun. Hats rose like monuments above their heads, laden with feathers, ribbons, and entire arrangements of artificial flowers. Precarious towers that drew eyes and admiration, but demanded a stiff neck and perfect balance to remain upright. Jewelry glittered in abundance, not a tasteful single piece, but cascades of bracelets, necklaces, and earrings that together weighed as much as the silverware on the table. And though the effect was breathtaking, it was also exhausting, for it to adorn oneself was to carry not only gold and gems, but also the unspoken burden of proving one's fortune without ever admitting the effort it required. Men, too, were trapped within this rivalry of appearance, their wardrobes filled with coats so heavily tailored that lifting an arm became a conscious act. Waistcoats embroidered with such intricacy that they resembled tapestry's collars, stiff enough to graze the chin with every turn of the head, and boots polished until they shone like black mirrors, even if their soles were too thin to endure more than a few steps without discomfort. Pocket watches dangled on chains of gold, fobs and seals jingling like the regalia of some minor monarch, and top hats rose to improbable heights, transforming every doorway into a hazard. To present oneself without these accoutrements was unthinkable, for in the eyes of peers, it suggested carelessness, or worse still, insufficiency of funds, and thus every gentleman marched into society as both participant and prisoner of this endless contest of cloth and ornament. What made it all more striking was that no one could ever truly win the battle of fashion, for as soon as one style had been mastered, another emerged to take its place. And so the wealthy lived in a perpetual cycle of acquisition, alteration, and replacement, their closets overflowing with yesterday's triumphs rendered obsolete by today's decree. And yet, despite the discomfort, despite the absurdity of teetering under hats that caught in carriage, doors, or jewels that bruised the collarbone they endured, because, in this world, clothing was not about covering the body, but about declaring to society, with every rustle of silk and every gleam of diamond, that here stood someone whose fortune allowed them to suffer extravagance for the sake of appearances. And in that suffering lay the true proof of their wealth. If the daylight hours were consumed by rituals of dress, dining, and display, the evenings brought yet another stage upon which wealth and refinement were expected to perform for leisure. In the households of the Victorian elite was never truly leisure at all, but rather another extension of the same relentless choreography that governed every corner of their existence. And instead of moments of freedom or relaxation, there came parlor gatherings where entertainment unfolded not as spontaneous joy, but as carefully curated demonstrations of culture, intellect, and taste. Guests would assemble in drawing rooms lit by chandeliers whose candlelight shimmered across polished surfaces, their bodies corseted and confined beneath layers of fabric that made even sitting a calculated act. And into this environment of restraint, the evening's amusements would be introduced not for the purpose of delight alone, but for the unspoken assessment of every participant's grace, wit, and knowledge. Parlor games, which in other settings might inspire laughter or playful competition, here became subtle contests of social cleverness, where charades and word puzzles were less about fun than about proving one's agility of mind while never slipping into vulgarity, and where losing too easily could be seen as a lack of spirit, while winning too eagerly suggested unbecoming ambition. So that every gesture, every guess, every smile carried layers of meaning far beyond the game itself. Music, too, was a frequent centerpiece, with pianos wheeled into action and young ladies pressed forward to perform selections of Chopin or Schubert, their fingers trembling not only from the difficulty of the score, but from the knowledge that the quality of their playing might influence whispers about the refinement of their upbringing. For, in this world, even a wrong note could echo like a social misstep. Readings were another favorite pursuit. Novels and poetry recited aloud with practiced intonation. Art, the chosen passages carefully selected to demonstrate education and taste without veering into controversy, while listeners nodded appreciatively, some genuinely engaged, others suppressing yawns behind lace fans or polished mustaches, yet all aware that their reactions were themselves being observed and judged. Conversation flowed in measured tones, never too loud, never too fast, circling politely around the safe topics of whether travel or society events, and though the words might appear trivial, the true substance lay in the elegance of delivery, in the ability to tell a story without appearing boastful, to offer an opinion without courting offense, to weave through the social currents with the practiced ease of someone who had spent their entire life rehearsing such exchanges. What was absent from these evenings was privacy, for every moment was shared, every performance scrutinized, and spontaneity was a luxury few dared risk, since an unguarded laugh, an unfiltered remark, or even a too obvious sign of boredom could linger in memory far longer than the games or music themselves. Thus, what might have been relaxation became another layer of performance, another way in which the wealthy proved their belonging, not through comfort or authenticity, but through the constant display of polish, restraint, and composure. And so the evenings of a Victorian millionaire, like their mornings and afternoons, were marked not by freedom, but by duty, the duty to embody its culture, to rehearse refinement, and to sustain the illusion that even their leisure was touched with grace. After the hours spent in parlors, proving refinement through games and conversation, the household would move toward what was often considered the true centerpiece of the day, not because it brought comfort or satisfied appetite, but because meals in the world of the Victorian millionaire were themselves grand spectacles, carefully orchestrated performances in which food, wine, and ritual combined to create a theater of status. To dine in such a home was to enter into an unspoken contract of endurance. For lunch and dinner alike stretched into multi-course marathons that seemed designed less to nourish than to test the stamina of both hosts and guests, with each dish arriving in stately procession, carried by footmen whose movements had been rehearsed as diligently as actors preparing for opening night. The dining room, with its long table gleaming under the weight of polished silver and flickering candelabras, became an arena where reputation was at stake in every detail. From the alignment of knives and forks to the temperature of the soup, which, more often than not, cooled while etiquette demanded restraint before the first spoonful could be taken. The dishes themselves were elaborate creations, many designed to astonish more than to delight. Towers of pastry concealing unlikely mixtures, joints of meat sculpted into improbable shapes, and most infamous of all, aspics gelatinous, castles encasing vegetables, fish, or even poultry, wobbling dangerously as they were carried across the room, admired for their artistry, though rarely enjoyed for their flavor. To decline such offerings was unthinkable, for refusal could be interpreted as insult, yet to consume them required bravery, and so each guest dutifully lifted fork to lips while exchanging glances of polite endurance, as if acknowledging that true refinement meant conquering not only social awkwardness, but culinary absurdity. Wine flowed in endless succession, each course paired with a different bottle drawn from cellars managed with obsessive pride by the butler, whose ability to produce the correct vintage at the correct temperature was itself a mark of the household as prestige. Glasses were never left empty, for the servants hovered with bottles at the ready, refilling almost before a sip had been taken, so that by the end of the evening, tongues were loosened in ways that etiquette struggled to contain, and conversations teetered on the edge of indiscretion before being carefully guided back into safer channels. Through it all, rituals governed every action: when to unfold the napkin, how to signal the desire for more food without appearing greedy, which fork to use for which dish, and above all, when to remain silent and allow the host or the guest of honor to steer the rhythm of conversation. Children, if permitted, at table at all, were placed at the farthest end under the watchful eye of a governess, their role not to eat heartily, but to sit as statues, absorbing the lessons of posture, restraint, and precision that would define their future lives. For the adults, the true feast lay not in the food, but in the opportunity to observe and be observed, to demonstrate refinement through patience, to prove sophistication by enduring a meal that lasted hours without betraying fatigue or hunger, and to emerge at last from the dining room not merely fed, but certified in the eyes of society as worthy of one's fortune. By the time the final course of fruit and cheese had been cleared, the air heavy with smoke from cigars and the sweetness of lingering puddings, the participants were left not with the satisfaction of appetite fulfilled, but with the weary triumph of having endured another ritual of wealth, another display of discipline and extravagance, another chapter in the ongoing theater that defined the life of the Victorian elite. As the echoes of clinking glass and murmured conversation faded from the dining room, the grand houses of the Victorian wealthy revealed another of their peculiar truths, one that spoke not of gilded mirrors or overflowing cellars, but of the children who were born into this world and yet rarely belonged fully to it. For in such households, sons and daughters were not first and foremost cherished companions or sources of daily joy. They were instead regarded as extensions of the family's reputation, living emblems of lineage and fortune, as ornaments in miniature who were to be polished, groomed, and displayed when appropriate, then quietly removed from sight when their presence threatened to disturb the perfection of the household as theater. These children, though surrounded by magnificence, were often denied the warmth of parental intimacy. Their daily lives governed not by mothers and fathers, but by nannies, governesses, and tutors, figures who became both their caretakers and their jailers, shaping their habits with discipline as relentless as the ticking of a clock. The nursery, tucked away in an upper floor or remote wing, was its own little kingdom, filled with toys that dazzled the eye dolls with porcelain faces, tin soldiers painted in bright uniforms, rocking horses carved with ornate saddles, but none of these could disguise the strict order that reigned there. Meals were taken at set hours, regardless of appetite. Lessons began punctually, whether the child's mind was ready or weary, and punishments for disobedience or even hesitation were administered with the severity of instructors convinced that shaping character required the sanding down of individuality. Tutors drilled the boys in Latin, mathematics, and history, not to foster curiosity, but to ensure that they would one day recite lines of Cicero at dinner tables without faltering, while governesses guided the girls through the arts of embroidery, pianoforte, and polite conversation. Lessons designed not to enrich their souls, but to prepare them for the drawing rooms, where they, too, would be judged by every gesture, every note, every stitch. The role of the parents in this arrangement was curiously distant, for fathers often regarded children as heirs to be inspected periodically, their progress measured like investments in a ledger, while mothers, themselves bound by the endless rituals of fashion and society, would sweep into the nursery for brief visits, offering a kiss on the forehead or a word of praise before departing once more to the spheres where appearances were weighed most heavily. For the children, these glimpses of parental affection were treasured but fleeting, overshadowed by the ever-present authority of the staff who ruled their day's figures, who might be stern, kind, or indifferent, but who always reminded them that they were being shaped not as individuals, but as representatives of a name and a fortune. When at last the children were permitted to descend from the nursery into the company of adults, they did so as carefully rehearsed performers. Their posture corrected, their voices modulated, their every word and gesture monitored, so that in the grand theater of dinners, teas, and visits, they became living proof that the household was as disciplined as it was wealthy. They might curtsy or bow with perfect precision, answer questions with the restraint of diplomats, and retreat again with the quiet obedience of servants, leaving behind the impression not of youthful spontaneity, but of miniature statues carved in the likeness of propriety. And so, even in childhood, the life of a Victorian millionaire's offspring was a study in performance, a childhood less of play and discovery than of training and polish, where innocence was traded for discipline, and individuality was smoothed into a polished surface meant to reflect the wealth and status of those who had brought them into the world, just as children were molded into polished reflections of their family's status. So too were the animals that shared these grand estates drawn into the endless theater of display. For in the world of the Victorian millionaire, a pet was never merely a companion to be loved for its loyalty or playfulness. It was instead another emblem of refinement, a living ornament through which wealth could be advertised and eccentricity excused. To stroll through a garden with an ordinary dog was considered far too plain, but to appear with a meticulously groomed spaniel in a velvet coat, or a parrot trained to greet visitors with witty phrases, or even some rare and exotic creature imported at great expense from distant colonies, that was to declare oneself a connoisseur, not only of fortune, but of taste, someone who could transform even the animal kingdom into an extension of their social performance. Dogs, the most common of these companions, were nonetheless transformed into spectacles, their fur brushed until it shone, their collars encrusted with silver or gold, their very names chosen to hint at elegance or lineage rather than affection. They were paraded before guests at afternoon teas, sometimes dressed in tiny garments to elicit admiration, and while the animals themselves may have squirmed under the weight of satin jackets or lace-trimmed capes, their discomfort was overlooked in favor of the delight it brought to onlookers, who might whisper about the ingenuity of a hostess whose spaniel's outfit matched the color of her gown. Parrots, with their bright plumage and sharper tongues, were trained not only to mimic, but to perform, reciting rehearsed lines that entertained drawing rooms already weary of endless, polite conversation. Their presence, a reminder that wealth could extend beyond jewels and silks into the very voices of foreign lands carried across the seas. The most extravagant households went still further, acquiring monkeys, peacocks, or even creatures of more questionable suitability large cats, bears, or reptiles displayed in private menageries or brought forth at parties as curiosities meant to astonish. For what could speak more loudly of fortune than the ability to own and feed an animal that most people would never see outside of illustrations in books? These exotic companions, often ill-suited to English climates and homes, were nonetheless prized for their rarity, and their very presence served as proof of global connections, of ships and traders and networks that brought the wonders of empire to one's doorstep. Of course, the labor of caring for these creatures fell not to their owners, but to the servants once more. Stable boys tasked with feeding parrots, maids ordered to launder dog garments, gardeners conscripted into cleaning up after peacocks, and though they might privately mutter about the absurdity of dressing a pug in a velvet jacket while children in the village went hungry, their grievances remained unheard, for the pet's appearance at a soirée was valued far above the servant's convenience. At the gatherings themselves, the animals were not hidden away, but rather presented, carried in arms, perched on shoulders, or lead on jeweled leashes through the salon, admired by guests who treated them as curiosities no less important than the silver on the table or the portraits on the wall. Thus, even in the realm of companionship, wealth demanded performance, and the creatures who, in another world, might have been simple friends or working beasts became instead silent participants in the ongoing pageant of luxury there, natural charm refashioned into yet another proof of status. To be a pet in the household of a Victorian millionaire was to be dressed, displayed, and admired, not for what one was, but for what one signified, and in this way the very innocence of animals was pressed into the service of a society obsessed with appearances, leaving behind the strange impression that in such houses nothing, neither children, nor servants, nor even the family dog escaped the relentless demand to shine as a symbol of fortune. And beyond the glittering salons filled with pets in ribbons and parrots chattering like miniature jesters, there existed an even more delicate theater, one not built of marble or velvet, but of paper, porcelain, and the unyielding weight of etiquette, for in the rarefied world of the Victorian elite, social climbing was not achieved with sudden gestures or bold displays, but through the slow, meticulous dance of ritualized interactions, where a calling card placed upon a silver tray could speak louder than a declaration, where a glance across a tea table carried the power to elevate or to ruin, and where every detail, down to the way a fork was held or how many lumps of sugar one dared drop into a cup, was invested with meaning. To navigate this world required the steady nerves of a diplomat and the memory of an actor, for no rule was too small to be enforced, and no slip too trivial to escape notice, and those who failed to master the art of these codes soon found doors closed to them, their names missing from guest lists, their reputations eroded by whispers that spread like smoke through the parlors of the city. The ritual of calling cards epitomized this system, for these small rectangles of stiff paper were not tokens of courtesy, but instruments of strategy, the very currency of social advancement. To leave a card at the door of a household was to announce one's presence in society, to request the possibility of connection without the vulgarity of direct intrusion. And yet, even in this simple act, rules proliferated. A corner folded meant congratulations, another signified condolences, initials scrawled in pencil might signal urgency or intimacy, and the placement of the card, whether delivered by hand or left with the servant, spoke volumes about the intentions of the sender. Families collected these tokens as though they were medals, arranging them in trays for visitors to admire, proof that their circle was as glittering as the chandeliers that hung above their dining tables. Tea parties, seemingly genteel gatherings of friends and acquaintances, were in truth examinations conducted in porcelain and pastry, each one an opportunity to demonstrate refinement and to measure the refinement of others. The pouring of tea, the offering of sandwiches cut into impossibly delicate triangles, the placement of teaspoons upon saucers, all of these became coded gestures their meanings instantly legible to those trained in the language of manners. Sugar itself was a battlefield of symbolism. One lump might signal restraint. Two suggested indulgence, and to ask for a third was to risk being branded as vulgar. Conversations, meanwhile, floated on a stream of trivialities, remarks about weather, gardens, or novelties. Beneath their surface lay undercurrents of evaluation. Each word weighed not for its substance, but for the polish of its delivery. And in this environment, even silence could become dangerous, for it might be interpreted as ignorance or disdain. Forks, knives, and spoons became weapons in this unspoken duel. Their correct use less about practicality than about precision, for to select the wrong implement was to announce oneself as an impostor, someone unworthy of the company in which they sat. Guests watched one another as carefully as hawks, their eyes trained to notice the tilt of a glass, the angle of a wrist, the hesitation before a bite. And from these observations, entire reputations were built or destroyed. It was not enough to be wealthy. One had to display that wealth through mastery of 1,000 invisible codes, each more exhausting than the last, until the act of simply eating or drinking became a gauntlet of social performance. And thus, the game of climbing, of maintaining one's precarious position on the slippery ladder of society, consumed every hour and every gesture, leaving behind a world where no detail was too small to matter, and no performance too trivial to rehearse. The millionaire might believe himself secure within his mansion, his servants and pets arrayed as emblems of fortune, but in truth his place depended upon the tilt of a fork, the fold of a card, the sweetness of tea, and the endless vigilance required to prevent a single misstep from sending him tumbling into the obscurity he most feared. For all the power of calling cards and the delicate maneuvers of tea tables, there remained one symbol of status that outshone every other of possession, so definitive that without it, even the wealthiest merchant or banker could never quite be admitted into the highest circle. And that was the country estate, the sprawling ancestral seat that served not only as a home, but as a declaration carved into the very earth. To own such a property was to proclaim that one's family did not merely exist in the present moment of fortune, but had roots that stretched deep into the soil. Whether or not those roots were genuine, for in truth many of these houses were recently acquired by families eager to cloak their new wealth in the borrowed dignity of the landed gentry. The estates rose from the countryside like monuments, their sweeping façades lined with colonnades and towers, their acres stretching into carefully sculpted landscapes dotted with lakes, follies, and artificial ruins meant to evoke antiquity. From afar, they seemed magnificent, the kind of structures one might imagine in novels or paintings, but to step inside was to discover the peculiar irony of such grandeur, for the very houses that proclaimed superiority were often cold, impractical, and riddled with inconveniences that would have baffled their admiring visitors. Drafts slithered through corridors so vast that no fire could ever quite warm them, leaving residents huddled beneath shawls, even as they entertained guests with tales of their enviable comfort. Roofs leaked despite their stately appearance, and tapestries designed to dazzle concealed not only damp stone, but the scurrying of mice emboldened by centuries of occupation. Tire wings might stand unused for months at a time, their furniture shrouded in dust covers, their silence broken only by the creak of old timbers and the whispers of servants who spoke, half in jest and half in fear of ghosts lingering in stairwells or drifting through moonlit halls. To walk these corridors at night was to feel both pride and unease, for while the estate anchored the family in the eyes of society, it also weighed upon them as a vast, crumbling responsibility, demanding constant repair, endless staff, and a tolerance for discomfort that contradicted the very idea of luxury. And yet, none of these flaws diminished the estate's power as a badge of superiority. For to invite guests to a weekend gathering in the countryside was to assert, 1. its membership in the exclusive world of landowners. A world where the city's wealth might glitter, but true prestige was believed to lie in acres of rolling parkland, in stables filled with thoroughbreds, in libraries lined with leather-bound volumes that no one ever read. Visitors marveled at the scale, at the endless rows of windows, and the symmetry of gardens planned to the inch. And they returned to town, whispering not about the damp sheets or the haunted nurseries, but about the grandeur, the permanence, the unshakable aura of a family rooted in stone and soil. In this way, the country estate functioned not merely as a home, but as a mask, concealing its drafts and ghosts behind a façade of majesty. And for the Victorian millionaire, there was no achievement greater than to possess such a place, however impractical, for it meant not only wealth, but recognition, not only fortune, but a claim however tenuous upon history itself. Beneath the grandeur of the country estate, behind the marble facades and the acres of landscaped gardens, there always lingered a quieter truth, one that polite society preferred to veil in discretion. For while these houses stood as monuments to permanence and lineage, the fortunes that sustained them were often far more recent, built not upon ancient titles, but upon the restless engines of trade and industry, upon ventures that stretched across oceans and rails, and upon profits that were celebrated in drawing rooms but seldom discussed in detail. The polite fiction was that wealth had simply existed, inherited like the portraits that lined the staircases. Yet, in reality, many of the great fortunes of the Victorian age were forged in the smoke of factories, the salt spray of shipping lanes, the brutal toil of colonial plantations, and the thunder of locomotives that carved steel veins through the countryside. Shipping, that old but ever profitable enterprise, provided one of the most common foundations. For the seas carried not only passengers, but vast quantities of goods, cotton, tea, coffee, and tobacco, each cargo filling the coffers of families who rarely saw the waves themselves. Sugar-sweet and seemingly innocent upon the Victorian tea table was, in truth, one of the most lucrative commodities of the age, its profits flowing in golden rivers to those who controlled its trade, yet few in society cared to acknowledge the grim realities that underpinned it, preferring instead to focus on the refinement of silver sugar tongs and the delicate placement of cubes into porcelain cups. Colonial investments, meanwhile, extended the reach of the empire into distant lands, bringing back not only spices and silks, but dividends that transformed ambitious merchants into lords of the countryside. And though everyone knew these profits existed, they were wrapped in euphemisms, described vaguely as interests abroad, never probed too deeply lest their origins stained the illusion of refinement. The railroads, perhaps the boldest and most visible of these engines of fortune, reshaped the landscape both literally and socially, their iron tracks slicing through fields and towns, binding the nation together with speed and power. To invest in such ventures was to gamble on the future, but for those who guessed rightly, the rewards were staggering. And soon they too built mansions and purchased estates, eager to conceal the soot of industry beneath the polish of old-world elegance. Yet, even here, conversation remained discreet, for to speak too openly of dividends, shares, and profits risked sounding crass, as though one had not yet learned that the proper role of wealth in polite society was not to be acknowledged, but to be silently displayed. And so, at dinners and teas, the origins of fortune were treated like ghosts that haunted the great houses always present, rarely named. Guests admired the chandeliers without asking how the oil that fed them was procured. They praised the gardens without considering the colonial plants that filled them, and they complimented the wines without questioning the shipping empires that delivered them. To belong to the upper ranks of Victorian society was not simply to be wealthy, but to master the art of transforming new money into the illusion of ancient respectability, to polish away the sweat and smoke of commerce until only the glitter of chandeliers and the gleam of silver remained, leaving behind a world in which fortunes, built on trade, sugar, rails, and empires stood cloaked in silence, admired for their results, but never interrogated for for their origins. Yet, the accumulation of wealth, however vast, was only half the battle. For in the rarefied world of the Victorian elite, the far greater challenge lay in its preservation. And this task was neither glamorous nor simple, but a constant, delicate balancing act that required vigilance, secrecy, and an ever-present fear of scandal. For all the glitter of chandeliers and the polish of silver, fortunes were more fragile than they appeared. Threatened not only by economic downturns or reckless speculation, but also by the caprices of reputation. And so the millionaire's daily existence was shadowed by the knowledge that a single misjudged investment, a careless word at a dinner table, or an indiscreet dalliance whispered about in drawing rooms could undo in weeks what generations had labored to build. Behind the velvet curtains of the drawing room and the theatrical excess of dinner parties lay offices where ledgers were kept with meticulous care lines of figures inked in neat columns that told stories more vital than any opera or novel. Bankers and solicitors became as essential to the household as butlers and cooks. Their role not to entertain, but to guard, for the fortune was not simply to be spent, but to be managed. Its flow directed like water through channels that must never run dry. Investments were chosen with caution, sometimes in railroads, sometimes in colonial ventures, always with an eye to security, and an ear tuned to whispers of opportunity, and if risks were taken, they were rarely spoken of in polite company. For nothing was more unseemly than to appear as though one's wealth might still be dependent on chance. Secrecy was equally vital, for money talked, and when it did so too loudly, it often drew unwelcome attention. Thus, the true size of incomes was rarely disclosed, hidden behind vague phrases such as comfortable means or a considerable estate, while the reality of debts, mortgages, or risky loans was concealed as fiercely as any family scandal. Accounts were shuffled, allowances granted to sons or daughters, in sums carefully calculated to impress, but not to reveal. And the true state of affairs was known only to a trusted few, who in turn bore the weight of ensuring that the illusion of endless prosperity never faltered. But perhaps the greatest threat was not financial at all, but social. For scandal had the power to destroy even the most robust fortune, and so lives were lived in constant vigilance against whispers that might spread from parlors to newspapers, tarnishing a name that no amount of wealth could polish clean again. A son caught in indiscretion, a daughter seen in the wrong company, a business connection revealed to be less than reputable. Any of these could cast shadows over a family, reducing invitations, lowering glances, and tightening the doors of society. Thus, the millionaire's household existed in perpetual watchfulness, every member coached, every action scrutinized, for the empire of appearances rested not only upon gold, but upon silence, restraint, and the delicate art of never allowing the world to glimpse the machinery behind the curtain. And so, maintaining wealth became itself a performance, one that demanded as much discipline as dressing for dinner or hosting a ball. A performance in which every figure in a ledger, every smile at a soiree, every secret locked in a desk was part of the choreography that kept fortune alive. To be rich in Victorian England was not merely to possess money, but to live in a state of continual management. To guard one's fortune as a knight guards a fortress, knowing that the enemies of ruin, scandal, decay, and indiscretion lurked at every edge of the grand estate. If the careful guarding of ledgers and the relentless suppression of scandal kept a fortune intact in the shadows, then in the blazing light of chandeliers and candlelit halls, it was the grand ball, the glittering party that displayed it for all the world to see. For no test of wealth and influence was greater than the ability to host a gathering so opulent, so resplendent, and so unforgettable that it lingered in the whispers of society long after the last carriage had rolled away into the night. These events were not mere entertainments, but spectacles of deliberate magnificence, stages upon which reputations could be made with a single bow or destroyed with a single misstep. And so every detail, from the musicians engaged to the flowers arranged, carried a significance that extended far beyond decoration, serving instead as a declaration of the host's power, taste, and command of the delicate machinery of high society. The evening would begin with the arrival of guests in a procession of carriages that clattered up the long drive, each bearing figures glittering in jewels and silks, their names announced by liveried footmen at the entrance, with voices that carried into the vaulted halls. Inside, the orchestra struck up, filling the air with the strains of waltzes and quadrilles. Music chosen not merely to entertain, but to establish the grandeur of the occasion, for to hire the finest musicians was to assert one's supremacy as a patron of the arts. Tables groaned under the weight of delicacies imported from across the globe, hams glazed to perfection, towers of sugared fruits, custards shimmering under golden torchlight, and wines that had slumbered in cellars for decades awaiting this night of unveiling. These were less food than symbols, reminders that the host commanded not only wealth but reach, connections, and refinement. As the dancers swept across polished floors, their movements illuminated by 1,000 candles reflected in mirrors, conversations bloomed at the edges of the room, conversations that mattered far more than the steps of the dance itself. Here gossip flowed as freely as champagne whispered assessments of gowns and partners of who had been invited, and, more telling still, who had not, of which fortunes were rising, and which might be faltering behind the mask of magnificence. It was in these murmured exchanges, traded between fans and mustaches, that reputations were stitched together or torn apart, for to stumble in conversation, to offend with a careless remark, or to arrive in a gown deemed tasteless, could inflict wounds no doctor might heal, and always like shadows cast by the brilliance of the chandelier's scandal, hovered close at hand, inevitable as the dawn, waiting to ignite from the smallest spark a misplaced glance, a dance held too long a disappearance into a side corridor that would furnish society with weeks of whispered speculation. Yet, such risks were precisely what gave these gatherings their allure. For every guest understood that to attend a ball was not simply to eat and dance, but to participate in a grand theater where the stakes were nothing less than honor, influence, and survival within the treacherous hierarchy of the elite. To host successfully was to emerge radiant, your household spoken of with admiration, and envy. To falter was to invite ridicule, your fortune weighed against your failure in the unforgiving scales of society. Thus, the ball was both triumph and trial, a glittering illusion spun from music, food, and light, but beneath its shimmer lay the same relentless truth that haunted every aspect of a millionaire's life in the Victorian age. Nothing, not even joy, was free of performance, and every pleasure carried with it the heavy price of scrutiny. And when the chandeliers had dimmed, the gossip had settled into memory, and the last echoes of music had faded from the ballroom, the cycle of performance did not end, for even beyond the walls of the mansion the same relentless theater followed, especially in that most dreaded of undertakings for the wealthy Victorian household, travel. To imagine it as a liberating escape would be to misunderstand entirely, for journeys were not acts of freedom, but elaborate campaigns of logistics, so complex and exhausting that they often seemed less like pleasure and more like war with servants, marshaled like soldiers' trunks, stacked like fortifications, and every mile threatening some fresh disaster. For while the prospect of retreating to the country, visiting the seaside, or embarking on a grand tour across Europe glittered in imagination, the reality was a bone-rattling ordeal that tested patience, dignity, and sometimes even sanity. The preparations alone were enough to overwhelm, for no millionaire could travel lightly. Not when appearances demanded that wardrobes for every occasion be transported across counties or even continents. Dozens of trunks, some large enough to serve as coffins, were hauled from attics and basements, each one packed with gowns, coats, gloves, hats, boots, toiletries, and the endless paraphernalia without which the household could not hope to survive a week away. Servants scurried under the weight of these burdens, their arms trembling as they loaded carriages already groaning under the strain, while the butler, red-faced and stern, attempted to impose order on the chaos, ticking items off endless lists. Aware that a forgotten parasol or missing cufflink might unleash storms of dissatisfaction once the journey was underway, the conveyances themselves offered no reprieve, for carriages jolted and rattled along uneven roads with such violence that passengers emerged shaken and bruised, their teeth chattering from the relentless pounding of wheels against stone. Trains, though hailed as marvels of modernity, offered chaos of their own. Platforms thronged with porters shouting and passengers shoving, compartments crammed so tightly that skirts were crushed and hats bent out of shape, corridors echoing with the cries of infants and the hiss of steam. The wealthy, accustomed to control within their estates, found themselves suddenly thrust into a world where timetables dictated their movements, where strangers pressed against them, and where the dignity of a silk gown might be undone in seconds by a gust of soot from a locomotive. And then there were the mishaps, inevitable and humiliating, the trunks that vanished between stations, the servants who fell ill mid-journey, the sudden downpours that soaked carefully prepared outfits, the wheels that splintered on country lanes, sending passengers stumbling into muddy ditches. Stories of such disasters circulated almost as eagerly as gossip from balls, whispered with a mixture of horror and amusement. For nothing delighted society more than the image of a rival stranded at a rural inn with only a half-unpacked trunk to their name. Yet despite the misery, the discomfort, and the constant risk of indignity, travel remained unavoidable, for to refuse it was to risk seeming provincial, while to endure it was to prove once again that wealth was not about comfort, but about perseverance in the face of extravagance. Thus, the journeys of Victorian millionaires became yet another chapter in their endless theater of appearances, where even the act of moving from one place to another became a spectacle of burden and display. The rumble of carriages and the shriek of train whistles underscoring the same truth that haunted every glittering hall and silent nursery, that wealth, for all its splendor, carried with it an unceasing demand for performance, and no mile of road or rail could ever carry its owners away from the obligations of their fortune. And if the rigors of travel tested the patience of the wealthy with rattling carriages and soot-stained trains, then the trials that awaited them when illness inevitably intruded were still more unnerving. For medicine in the Victorian age, even for those who commanded the greatest fortunes, was less a science than a patchwork of guesswork, superstition, and dangerous remedies that often seemed to do more harm than the ailments they were meant to cure. To fall ill in a mansion of wealth was not to summon comfort or confidence, but to step into a theater of uncertainty where doctors, with solemn faces and impressive sideburns, prescribed treatments that to modern eyes appear less like healing and more like torment, yet were accepted then as the height of learned wisdom. Leeches, for instance, clung persistently to the pages of medical fashion, their slippery bodies applied to pale flesh in the belief that by drawing blood they could draw out illness, and though patients shuddered as the creatures wriggled and fed, they were reassured that relief would soon follow, even if weakness, faintness, or infection came instead. Mercury, a substance we now know to be poison, was dispensed in potions and ointments with confidence, its metallic bite believed to purge impurities, though more often it corroded the body from within, leaving trembling hands and rotting teeth as evidence of its supposed healing touch. Laudanum, a potent mixture of opium and alcohol, flowed freely from apothecaries' jars, offered as cure for sleeplessness, pain, melancholy, or even the restlessness of children, and though it dulled suffering, it bound countless patients in chains of dependency. Their fortunes squandered as much on repeated doses as on the doctors who prescribed them. Even food was pressed into service as medicine, with beef tea standing as one of the era's strangest panaceas, a thin broth strained from hours of boiling meat until it contained little but watery strength, poured reverently into cups and offered as a restorative. To the sick, though, it nourished the spirit more by ritual than by substance. Alongside these dubious staples thrived a forest of home remedies passed from mouth to mouth with the conviction of gospel. Mustard plasters pressed to the chest until skin burned, vinegar-soaked rags wrapped around fevers, mixtures of herbs gathered in the belief that nature's touch could succeed where science faltered. Servants often whispered their own cures, drawn from older traditions, while mistresses of houses clung to recipe books filled with strange concoctions, convinced that salvation might be found in the right combination of spices, oils, or powders. And yet, despite the discomfort, the risk, and the absurdity of so many of these methods, the wealthy submitted to them with the same stoic endurance they brought to corsets, cold toast, and rattling carriages, for to reject the advice of one's physician was unthinkable, a sign of distrust that could itself give rise to whispers and suspicion. Illness became not only a battle against the body's weakness, but another performance to be endured with grace. The patient reclining in bed while servants hushed their footsteps, while visitors expressed solemn hopes of recovery, and while doctors returned with fresh instructions that promised relief but delivered suffering anew. In the end, the most effective treatment was often time itself. But in the interim, the grand households of Victorian England were filled with the scent of camphor, the flicker of candlelight over rows of bottles, and the murmurs of anxious relatives who knew that even with all the wealth in the world, no guarantee of health could be purchased. Only the illusion of control through rituals as precarious as the age itself. If the sick room revealed the limits of wealth, then the ballroom revealed its opportunities for display, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the sphere of philanthropy. For charity in the world of the Victorian elite was never merely an act of compassion, but a performance, a ritualized expression of benevolence conducted under the brightest possible lights, where the giving of money or time was as carefully orchestrated as the pouring of wine at dinner, designed not only to ease suffering, but to polish reputations and secure one's place upon the precarious ladder of respectability. To give was expected, but to give conspicuously, with elegance and flourish, was what truly mattered. And so philanthropy became yet another stage upon which the wealthy rehearsed their roles with precision, weaving generosity into the fabric of their public identities. Charity galas stood at the center of this spectacle, evenings in which glittering halls were filled not only with music and fine gowns, but with speeches, pledges, and presentations that transformed compassion into ceremony. Guests arrived in carriages as if attending a ball, their jewels flashing and their gowns trailing, but instead of dancing alone, they sat at long tables where causes were extolled and appeals made, their purses loosened not simply by sympathy, but by the subtle knowledge that every coin given, every banknote pledged, was witnessed, recorded, and remembered. Public donations carried even greater weight, for it to be named in newspapers as the benefactor of a hospital wing, a schoolhouse, or a relief fund was to acquire a form of immortality. One's generosity inscribed in print and praised in drawing rooms where rivals could not ignore it. This culture of giving, however, was far from free of competition. For wealthy families vied with one another to prove not only who could spend the most upon gowns or estates, but who could outshine the rest in apparent benevolence. To contribute a modest sum was honorable, but to offer an extravagant one, to endow entire institutions, or to distribute gold among the poor at Christmas was to demonstrate not only wealth, but magnanimity, a double proof of superiority that both elevated the giver and bound recipients in silent gratitude. Even the act of visiting the poor was transformed into a ritual of display. Ladies descending in polished carriages to distribute blankets or soup, their gestures immortalized in society pages as evidence of their goodness. Though the servants who hauled the goods and the poor who received them often knew how fleeting such compassion might truly be, and yet, for all its artificiality, philanthropy served a vital purpose in maintaining the structure of society, allowing the wealthy to cleanse the harsher origins of their fortunes, whether in sugar railroads or colonial trade, by wrapping them in the language of charity. It gave the illusion that fortune was not merely hoarded, but shared, that privilege carried with it responsibility, even if that responsibility was carefully measured and strategically displayed. In this way, giving became both shield and sword, a defense against criticism and a weapon in the ongoing battle for prestige, ensuring that the names of benefactors were spoken, not with envy alone, but with admiration, and perhaps even a grudging gratitude. Thus, the act of charity, like every other aspect of life in the Victorian millionaire's world, was another performance, one more ritual in the endless theater of wealth, where sincerity mattered less than spectacle, and where every coin dropped into a collection plate rang as loudly in the ears of society as the finest waltz played by an orchestra at a ball. And when one steps back from the glitter of chandeliers, the echo of orchestras, the rustle of gowns, and the solemn recitations of generosity, what emerges most vividly is not a portrait of effortless privilege, but a tableau of contradictions. For the life of the Victorian millionaire, so often envied and admired from afar, was, in truth, a labyrinth of absurd burdens disguised as blessings, a constant performance in which every comfort concealed an inconvenience, and every pleasure carried with it an equal measure of strain. To the casual observer, it seemed to dream like mansions with soaring ceilings, carriages drawn by glossy horses, estates stretching across green hills, but within those gilded walls, the weight of wealth pressed, heavily demanding vigilance, restraint, and endless attention to rituals that often smothered spontaneity and joy. The satire lies in the sheer contrast between appearance and reality. The grand country house that proclaimed prestige, yet froze its inhabitants with drafts. The endless trunks of travel that turned journeys into ordeals. The tables groaning with food that guests dared not truly enjoy for fear of violating etiquette. The gowns and corsets that signaled refinement, even as they squeezed breath and movement from their wearers. Wealth did not free its owners. It bound them more tightly, obliging them to live lives of careful choreography in which nothing, not even the act of sipping tea or offering a sugar lump, could be done without thought to how it might be perceived. In this way, fortune was less a liberation than a prison of expectations, its walls decorated with velvet and gold, but its air heavy with the suffocating pressure of performance. Yet, beneath the satire rests the undeniable truth of history, for the absurdities of this world were not inventions, but realities, chronicled in diaries, etiquette manuals, and newspapers that revealed how society turned wealth into theater. Every detail, from the precise fold of a calling card to the construction of an elaborate hat, carried significance. Every misstep, from the wrong fork at dinner to a careless remark at a ball, threatened to erode reputations painstakingly built over generations. These burdens were not accidental, but systemic, part of a culture that prized appearances above comfort, that measured worth not by happiness, but by adherence to codes that grew ever more complex, leaving even the most fortunate trapped in a cycle of display and judgment. Thus, the narrative, in balancing satire with detail, does more than amuse. It exposes the irony of an age where privilege itself became a burden, where the very symbols of success, the mansion, the estate, the glittering ball, were also chains that bound their owners to a life of endless vigilance. To laugh at the excesses of beef tea and sugar lumps is to glimpse the comedy of human vanity, but to recognize the truth behind them is to understand that the wealthiest Victorians, for all their jewels and titles, were as much prisoners of their society as those who served them. And so, behind the curtains of velvet and the facades of marble, the millionaire's life was not a paradise, but a pageant, one that dazzled the world, even as it quietly consumed those forced to play their roles upon its relentless stage. What becomes most striking when the glittering pieces are gathered together and the picture of this gilded world stands complete is the realization that wealth in Victorian society was never simply about abundance, indulgence, or ease, but rather by the relentless pressure of performance, for to be rich was to exist under a spotlight that never dimmed, one in which every movement, every glance, every choice of word or garment or fork was scrutinized and measured against the unyielding codes of propriety. The illusion of luxury concealed a deeper truth that comfort, that rarest of human desires, was the one thing wealth could not buy, because to relax, to be unguarded, to forget for even a moment the rules that bound the elite, was to risk catastrophe, a social misstep that could unravel the careful tapestry of status more quickly than any financial disaster. Day after day, this performance demanded endless rehearsals, the valet standing ready with starched collars so the gentleman would not sully himself with the indignity of dressing alone, the lady cinched into her corset until breath itself became a calculated act, the grand breakfasts that were not meals but ceremonies of rank, the endless calling cards that fluttered like paper currency in the economy of reputation. In every corner of the household, from the grand salons filled with music and gossip to the kitchens where servants toiled unseen, the theater of appearances was performed without rest, a drama in which the actors themselves were often trapped by the very roles that defined them. The fear that accompanied this existence was constant, subtle, and suffocating. To stumble in a dance, to choose the wrong spoon, to invite the wrong guests, or utter a careless phrase at the wrong moment, any of these might ignite whispers that spread with merciless speed, eroding the careful façade upon which so much depended. For the wealthy ruin was not only a matter of empty coffers, but of diminished standing, of being excluded from the dinner tables and ballrooms where reputations were burnished or destroyed, and so life became an unending exercise in vigilance, a performance without intermission. In this light, the grandeur of chandeliers and country estates seems less like privilege and more like burden, less like paradise and more like prison. For while fortunes could command armies of servants and the finest of goods, they could not protect their owners from the exhausting demand to appear perfect at all times. To be rich in the Victorian world was to be watched ceaselessly, to exist not in one's own skin, but in the reflection of others' eyes. And thus the story of the millionaire's life is not one of true luxury, but of endless pretense, a dazzling spectacle that shimmered brightly upon the surface, even as it eroded those who lived within it. And so, as the final curtain falls upon this intricate pageant of wealth, what lingers is not only the image of glittering gowns, endless courses of cold toast and aspic, or the rattling carriages weighed down by trunks, but the larger truth that to be rich in the Victorian world was to live one-ass life as both actor and audience, forever rehearsing and performing in the endless theater of privilege. Fortune was never a quiet possession, never something that could be enjoyed in solitude without consequence. It was a spectacle meant for others to witness, responsibility that stretched far beyond the management of estates or the balancing of ledgers, peering instead into every glance, every handshake, every carefully phrased invitation. Wealth became legacy as families strove to ensure their names would echo beyond their own lifetimes, graved in stone above hospital wings or whispered in awe when carriages rolled up to a country estate. Wealth became eccentricity, for those who could afford to defy the ordinary often cloaked their anxieties in peculiar habits and theatrical displays that amused society while also setting them apart. And above all, wealth became obligation, a ceaseless chain of duties to attend dinners, host galas, fund charities, and maintain appearances in a world that judged relentlessly and forgave sparingly. The result was a life as exhausting as it was glittering, filled with amusements that were never quite free of calculation and obligations, that were never entirely voluntary, a life where even pleasure had to be measured, rehearsed, and displayed. Yet, in its absurdities, its contradictions, and its constant balancing act between display and discomfort, there lies a humor that continues to fascinate. for to watch the millionaires of the Victorian age struggle beneath the gilded weight of their own fortunes is to glimpse both the comedy and the tragedy of privilege. Their lives invite laughter at the sheer excess of it, all the oversized hats, the sugar lump etiquette, the haunted country estates, but they also invite reflection, a recognition that privilege, however grand, never frees one from burden, and that the trappings of status so often conceal chains invisible to those who wear them until it is too late. And thus, the story closes with a smile tinged by thought, leaving us entertained by the theatrical absurdities of the past, yet quietly aware that the pursuit of wealth and status has always demanded something in return, that privilege has always carried its price, and that the pageant of appearances, whether played in candlelit ballrooms or in the glow of modern screens, continues to shape lives long after the last Victorian waltz has faded into silence. The life of a Victorian millionaire, when pieced together from the fragments of their daily rituals, begins to resemble not a life of luxury, but a stage production, elaborate and unending, where wealth itself is both the prop and the prison. What seemed to the outside world like unimaginable comfort was in truth a carefully rehearsed routine of extravagance, eccentricity, and obligation, each moment polished until it glittered, yet weighed down by the burden of constant scrutiny. From the very first hour of the morning, when a valet laid out starched linen shirts and servants brought basins of tepid water, to the very last hour of the night, when candle flames flickered in drafty halls of cavernous country estates, every detail of existence was dictated by expectations so rigid that even joy itself became a matter of performance. Bathing, which one might imagine as a private moment of renewal, became instead a spectacle of inconvenience, a cold room, an enormous tub, unreliable plumbing, and an entourage of attendants holding soaps and cloths that stung more than they soothed. Dressing transformed into a ritual of bondage corsets, laced until ribs protested, collars starched so stiff that movement became an ordeal. Shoes chosen not for walking, but for display, and accessories piled one upon another until the body resembled less a person than a gallery of wealth on parade. Even the act of breakfasting, which in simpler homes might be a warm and nourishing start to the day, became in these grand houses a chilly tableau of rank, with cold toast laid on silver trays, with seating arrangements dictated by hierarchy, and with conversation bound so tightly by etiquette that spontaneity had no room to breathe. Behind this pageantry, the great household machinery churned ceaselessly, with cooks, butlers, gardeners, tutors, and maids orchestrated into invisible harmony, their labor erased from the polished surface of aristocratic life. They lived in constant fear of mistakes, for a broken plate or mistimed dish could ripple upward into disgrace. Yet, without them, the illusion of effortless wealth collapsed. Their masters, though swathed in silks and diamonds, were equally trapped, bound by costumes and customs that left little space for comfort or authenticity. Fashion, entertainment, and dining all carried the same burden. Clothes were less about personal taste than about rivalry. Their heaviness, a reminder that appearances outweighed comfort. Entertainment rarely resembled leisure. It was conversation under watchful eyes, parlor games whose charm lay in their predictability, readings that showcased refinement rather than delight, meals stretched into ceremonies of excess, with dish upon dish carried in procession, some so unappetizing that they lingered more as jokes than as pleasures, yet each course served as proof of wealth. Children, raised more by nannies and tutors than by their own parents, became ornaments of the household, taught not to flourish but to represent. Even pets became props in this elaborate performance. Parrots and dogs costumed and paraded, not as companions, but as emblems of status. The outside world mirrored the inside one for social climbing, relied not upon genuine connection, but upon rituals of calling cards, tea services, and the mastery of coded gestures, where even sugar lumps or the placement of a fork held layers of meaning. Above it all loomed the great estates, vast and magnificent, yet often cold, impractical, and whispered to be haunted, their very inconveniences overlooked because their ownership was the ultimate badge of superiority. The fortunes that purchased these estates were themselves shrouded in silence, drawn from shipping routes, sugar fields, colonial enterprises, in the roaring of trains across iron tracks, origins politely avoided in conversation, yet silently acknowledged in the gleam of chandeliers and the weight of silver. Keeping such fortunes intact was itself a daily performance, for ledgers had to be guarded, bankers consulted, debts concealed, and scandals avoided with vigilance bordering on obsession. Balls and galas, with their orchestras, glittering gowns, and endless rivers of gossip, were as dangerous as they were dazzling. For reputations could rise in a single evening or crumble before the final dance. Travel offered no escape, only another theater of burden, with trunks piled like fortresses, servants herding chaos onto rattling carriages or soot-stained trains, each journey a test of endurance and dignity. Illness to strip away the veneer of comfort, exposing the frailty of medicine that relied on leeches, mercury, laudanum, and beef tea, remedies more torturous than curative, endured because to reject the doctor's authority was unthinkable. Even philanthropy, noble in appearance, was itself a performance of wealth. Calas and donations staged less for the alleviation of suffering than for the polish of reputation. Each coin given echoing as loudly as a waltz played beneath the chandeliers. What unites these fragments is the irony that wealth, in its abundance, never liberated its owners, but bound them tighter to expectation, turning life into a series of obligations where every act was observed, judged, and recorded in whispers. Comfort, that simple goal, was the one thing denied, placed instead by vigilance, by the fear of missteps that could cast a shadow darker than debt. Legacy became the goal, eccentricity the refuge, obligation the constant companion. And so the Victorian millionaire lived not a life of ease, but of endless rehearsals for a performance they could never step away from. In the end, what remains is equal parts comedy and tragedy, a picture that amuses with its absurdities, even as it invites reflection on the price of privilege, on the strange truth that those who seem to have everything lived within invisible cages of their own making. And with that thought, let us close the curtain on this grand performance of another age. May the echoes of ballrooms and carriages fade gently in your mind, and as you drift into rest, may you find a peace far simpler and truer than any Victorian fortune ever provided. Good night and sleep well.